Mobile Suit Victory Gundam, a series which has and will continue to live in infamy. A show so widely regarded as painful, frustrating, and downright awful by its fans and even its creator, Mr. Tomino himself, that its reputation as the black sheep of the Gundam franchise is incredibly difficult to ignore, to the point where it is largely forgotten, and it's probably for the best that it is. Personally, I despised watching this show 6 years ago, in fact almost exactly 6 years ago, and while I have not rewatched it since then, I still very much so remember the feelings of anger and just downright agony sitting through all of its 51 episodes, which is the longest run of any singular Gundam series, by the way. From all the way back in 1993, today we are looking at Victory Gundam and everything that has made it so widely derided. Now, these thoughts are largely ones that I made note of back when I watched the show in 2016. And as a result, these ideas are not fresh in my memory. I am largely going off of what I wrote back then. But as I said before, I can certainly very vividly remember how angry watching this show made me. So let's see how this goes. Well, let's start with the characters, shall we? Always a great place to begin. The characters in this show are either infuriating or completely forgettable. Shakti, and every single time she gets kidnapped, again and again and again, even willingly letting herself get kidnapped, by the way, or instrumenting her kidnapping herself, just simply filled me with rage every time she tried to pull this bullshit. She constantly thinks she can convince the Zanskar Empire to just stop fighting by talking to Mr. Chronicle Asher himself, even though that method fails each and every time she attempts it. Plus, the fact that she gets people killed every time someone has to go and rescue her after she gets kidnapped only really makes her decisions more deplorable at the end of the day. Of course, I can't forget Katagina herself, who is maybe the most hated character in Gundam, possibly. And really, she doesn't serve a meaningful purpose in the show. Her reasons for aligning with Zanskar are barely elaborated on, and her joining them just happens so suddenly that it feels completely forced. In the end, she just becomes this completely insane person, hungry for blood. And considering that she was so forgettable in the terms of her involvement with the plot, who didn't really do anything noteworthy beforehand, I just feel like, why was she here, other than to be this crazy person running around causing trouble? One of the worst characters in Gundam by a mile. Although I do wonder if I hate her as much as I hate Shakti. That's a difficult question to answer, personally. Now, the main character, Uso, is fine, but nothing noteworthy as a protagonist. And then Chronicle Asher is a pretty whatever attempt at a Char clone, because he doesn't really have much in the way of clear-cut motives. Actually, I'd say all of the people aligned with the Zanskar Empire were either way too vague in their agenda or just completely pointless. They wanted to do what? Spread motherly love? Achieve peace somehow? So why are they trying to start a deadly war if those are their goals? Like, I know it's not unusual for Gundam series to have someone with the goal of ending war, but doing it through almost contradictory means. This is just a terrible way to attempt that, especially from the perspective of the villains. Obviously, you have the old dude with the monocle who just wanted power and was the guy who was really running the show with the Queen of Zanskar kind of as a puppet. But if he's supposed to be our main villain, right? Why does he get almost no screen time? We basically never get to see the inner workings of Zanskar planning and the motivation that they're trying to have, aside from the aforementioned, like, vaguely defined motherly love, peace, power kind of goals. And because of that, basically everyone in Zanskar just comes off as generically evil, crazy, or idiotically blind in the case of the Queen. Similarly to this, we get basically no world building in general, not just for Zanskar. Like, how did Zanskar even come into existence? How did the Federation get so weak since, like, F91? What is life on Earth even like, aside from the handful of minor villages we come across throughout the series? Is everybody on Zanskar just completely in love with the Queen and her healing abilities and just totally fine with the guillotine and the actions of the military? Like, how did the Queen even come to power? There are a lot of things that really should have been focused on instead of the show constantly wasting time with repetitive nonsense. You know, more pointless kidnapping, more killing off forgettable characters, more really boring mech battles that are not well animated. Even for a show from 1993, this does not look good in the slightest. And all of it just accomplishes nothing at the end of the day. I remember when I first started watching the show and I got through like maybe 20 episodes and I was still like, what am I watching? What is going on? Where is this going? What the hell is the point of all this? When a show that has 51 episodes, plenty of time to expand on things, has zero interest in doing it, you've got a big problem. And yes, there are many Gundam series that ran for way longer than they should have and did not have great world building. That's not a common or an uncommon thing to see in these shows, right? For better or for worse. Victory Gundam is probably the worst example of it, though, where there are so many things that could have very easily been expanded upon, and you would very likely expect to see expanded on, that just had no interest in even touching. And of course, let's touch on another very big and well-known aspect of the show. Its utterly massive body count. It's ridiculous. If you thought Zeta Gundam had this really crazy kill everybody gimmick at the end, which it did, oh boy, you have not any idea what it's like in Victory Gundam. They kill people, multiple people, like every episode. They even at one point basically say in the preview for the next episode that someone's going to die. The problem is 95% of the time, the characters that are dying are minor characters that we know basically nothing about and have no reason to care about. Maybe even characters that were introduced in that episode or in a very recent episode, right? It's one thing to have a big body count. It's another thing when you're just killing off random characters no one has any interest in. And that's what this show does. Now, yes, some people might find that appealing because it creates this very quote-unquote realistic interpretation of war where people are dying all the time. It's very bleak and it's very dark. But it's not really enjoyable or impactful from a storytelling perspective when almost none of the characters who are dying are memorable in any way. Characters get introduced just so they can die either that episode or a couple down the road. It is completely mind-boggling. And of course, it's a Gundam series, a full-length TV series. You gotta know that pacing is terrible. I touched on that before, but man, even if you have seen a lot of Gundam and you've come to expect poor pacing, the first chunk of episodes just have their events go by so rapidly. It just feels so nonsensical. It's why I felt like I had no idea what was going on initially. Only for everything afterwards to just drag and get really slow, as always, with the show having no direction outside of just the vague goal of, well, we gotta defeat Zanskar. I mean, of course, but that's it. Nothing else, nothing clearer. And the characters often will just go to space, go to Earth, go to space, go back to Earth, go back to space with barely any reason provided as to why they're doing it. A lot of the military operations come off as just random battles, or of course the rescue missions because Shakti decided to be stupid and get captured that day, or get herself captured that day. Because the show feels like it has no real direction, there ends up being no weight behind anything that's happening, especially when it's just another rescue mission to get Shakti or someone else back. Have I mentioned I hate Shakti? I don't know if I've been clear about that. Anyway, let's talk about the ending, because that is also unsatisfying as well, largely because we just don't get any sort of closure or information whatsoever about what happens to the Federation or to Zanskar. Instead, we just get a few minutes of the main characters dicking around at home, washing clothes. And look, that might have been fine if we also got the closure, right? If we got that and then this, sure, whatever. Or it might have been nice if I actually cared about any of those characters, but I don't. And when you waste 51 episodes dealing with this war between the Federation and the Zanskar, with this weakened Federation that's losing its control and struggling to maintain any semblance of power, with all these militias running around on Earth, show me the aftermath of all this. Show me what happens to them. What happens to the Federation going forward? What happens to Zanskar? Just what happens? Tell me. I spent all this time watching this show, and there's no closure about the one singular goal of, well, we got to defeat Zanskar. We got to end this war. We got to figure things out. What did you do? What the hell did you do? You didn't do any of that. You didn't do anything. So that's way more important than the stupid kids washing their clothes in the river. I hate the way this show ends. I hate having to sit through 51 episodes of nonsense, of plots that don't go anywhere, of characters that are infuriating, of repetitive kidnapping plots and repetitive battles that don't go anywhere, of poorly thought through world building, of all of these constant, frustrating problems that don't result in any sort of meaningful resolution at the end. This show is abysmal. It is one of the worst things I have ever had the displeasure of sitting through. And I know full well, if I had watched this now rather than 6 years ago, there is no way I would have sat through all of it. 6 years ago, I was much more willing to sit through garbage no matter how long it was. I would not do this now. And I do not wish the fate of watching Victory Gundam onto anybody. This is completely irredeemable, in my opinion. And also in the opinion of Tomino himself. Tomino has gone on record multiple times saying he hates this series. When it was released on DVD and more recently on Blu-ray, he actually went out of his way to say, for the love of God, do not buy this. If you do make the mistake of buying it, please try to find every single mistake in it. So even if you did buy it, he wanted you to come to the position of hating it by the end of the day. He really despises this show, and you can tell that Sunrise in general doesn't really like to acknowledge it much either. And there are a number of ideas as to why Tomino was pretty depressed at the time, and that's also probably why the show has such a high body count. This was also around the time that Sunrise and Gundam in general was trying to be bought by Bandai. There was supposedly a lot of executive meddling, and Tomino wasn't really able to do what he wanted. So for possibly all of these reasons, or even more that we don't know about, Tomino really dislikes this show. Sunrise seems to really dislike this show, and for all the reasons I just spent the past number of minutes talking about, most people in general do not like this show. Now, I have seen people who do like it, and more power to you if you can find something worth enjoying in all this, but my God, this is one of the worst things I've ever sat through. And it does give me a little bit of solace to know that even the people who made this show do not like it. And very notably, this was the final TV Universal Century Gundam series. After this, it was more or less all original universe content. You could argue, like, okay, well, we had Turn A, and Turn A is technically Universal Century, and then there was Reconquista in G, which is also technically Universal Century, but those are, like, so far removed from Universal Century in the sense that they're so far in the future. You know, you could debate that. Like, they are, but they're not like, oh, just a few years later, here's a new Universal Century TV series. It's like they're afraid to do one. Ever since 1993 and Victory Gundam Crashing and Burning, they're just too afraid to do it. Like, yeah, they've done, like, TV recompilations of some of the OVAs, like Unicorn and Origin, but if they've done Universal Century since, it's just been OVAs. And I think it's worked out for the best because those OVAs have much better pacing than a 50-episode series ever would. So it's good, but it's very interesting that you could argue this is why Gundam ultimately made the leap to alternate universes, right? Because before this, it was all Universal Century. G Gundam was the year after Victory. So, hey, if Victory had gone over better, who knows? Maybe we wouldn't have had G Gundam. Maybe we wouldn't have had a lot of these alternate universe shows. Maybe it would have just been Universal Century. So while this didn't kill the Gundam franchise, though there are people who would argue that maybe Tomino wanted it to, it did sort of end Universal Century's entire grip on it. Like, we started to get these alternate universe things, and the Universal Century stuff that we have gotten, and which has in many ways been very good. Like, Unicorn's great, Origin's great, but it's all been in, like, OVAs or movies. So very interesting to note the impact that this show and just how terrible it was had on the franchise going forward. So I guess, hey, maybe that's a positive thing about Victory Gundam, if there's anything at all. But I despise this show, and I 100% implore anybody listening to this to never, ever, ever sit through this nonsense. Unless you want to torture yourself, which, you know what? You do you, my guy. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to have to ever sit through this show ever again. I want to forget about it as much as Tomino and Sunrise, personally. With all that said, thank you for listening to me rant about a show that I haven't seen in 6 years, and I hope this at least convinces some people who might have been poorly considering watching this show to stay as far away from it as they can.